Welcome back to another episode of Too Fast, Too Furious. Photography style. We are gathered here today to talk about the fastest medium format lens in the world, the Mamiya Sekor 80mm 1.9 prime lens for the Mamiya 645 system. I think before we get going though, I think I should put out a GAS, Gear Acquisition Syndrome warning, because after this review, there's no doubt you're going to want this lens. Introduced into a world of shag carpet and lava lamps back in 1975, the Mamiya Sekor 80mm 1.9 lens was made from 1975 until 1990. Because this lens was built by Mamiya, which I can only assume is a byword for quality given my experiences with the brand, this lens will probably last for many, many years into the future. The build quality is really high. Think Snoop Dogg in a CBD factory high. Only 2 ingredients in this lens, metal and glass, and everything is engraved. All the markings are engraved and filled with paint, so this thing's built to last. The focus ring moves nice and smooth, just like me on the ball court back in the 5th grade. You know, I expected a lens with this wide of an aperture to be pretty big, but much like me getting out of the pool in the cold, it was quite a bit smaller than I thought.
I was in the pool! I was in the pool!
Like I said, the lens is pretty small, which also means it's pretty lightweight. 14.8 ounces or 8 gerbils. Makes no difference, 3 inches by 2.3 inches. Or 75.5 millimeters by 59 millimeters if you talk with a bit of an accent. Me, I don't have an accent. There is a C in the name of this lens, you can see it right there, which after doing precisely 3 minutes of research, the internet told me it stood for coating. Mamiya refers to this as the multi-layer coating that's applied to the surfaces of the lenses. They slather this stuff on and reduces flares and ghost. Basically, it's magic. Because they didn't have such fancy things as ultra extreme spherical lenses and 11 blade apertures, well, they probably had 11 bladed apertures in the 1970s. This lens is much more simple in its construction though. It's a rather simple 7 elements and 6 groups, which means that they almost had a group for each element, but unfortunately 2 had to share. The aperture of this lens only has 6 blades, which is notable because it's not that many. And looking at the front of the lens, there's a 67mm filter thread. These are metal threads, no risk of breaking. So that's pretty cool. Because this lens was created in a time before Al Gore created the internet, it doesn't have an army of fanboys yelling about its merits. And to be honest, there aren't that many videos on YouTube about the lens at all. Presumably because Mamiya can't be bothered to pay influencers to review a 30-year-old lens. And let me just assure you guys at home, no one's paying me to do these reviews, but not because I'm on some high moral crusade, but just because nobody's trying to pay me yet. Maybe obvious to some of you guys, but everything on this lens is manual, because this lens is a little bit old, like your mom. But you know, since they made this lens until 1990, this lens is probably at least in its MILF phase. Awkward transition here, but let's be honest, I did it to myself. Focusing is manual and the aperture ring is manual as well, and that's controlled on the lens barrel as it should be. You can hear it clicking. A second ago I said the focusing ring is very smooth. That's something reviewers always say. If we ever really encountered a lens that didn't have a smooth focusing ring, let me know in the comments. But let me tell you what would be really smooth, and that would be if you went over and hit the like button on this video. It would allow the video to go to more people. With this lens having such a wide aperture, that does create some problems. At f1.9, focusing on this lens is very hard. Like trying to put a leash on a tiger shark. Hard. I mean, you guys are gonna miss a lot of shots at 1.9, so you may wanna start taking multiple frames of things that you're shooting wide open. In terms of close focusing this lens, let's just say it's not a macro lens. Close focusing distance is 0.7 meters, so you're not able to get really close, but I mean, honestly, that's what we expect from these short telephoto lenses. 50mm lenses, which is what the equivalent of this is on 35mm. They're never known for their close focusing ability, and so this is pretty well in line with a normal 50. Pricing is gonna vary on a lens like this because you're gonna have to pick it up off of Camera Tender. They don't sell them new anymore. I gave about 400 smackaroos for this one, which seems pretty close to the going rate. Mine isn't in perfect condition. The nicer the condition, the more expensive the lens is gonna be. But I knew I was gonna probably get a few scratches on my lens anyway because I actually use most of my camera gear. Let's talk about the party piece of this lens though. The piece de résistance, as the French would say, or the piece de résistance, as we'd say in the back of the hollers of Kentucky. It's the insane light gathering ability of this lens. That's why everyone would be buying this lens. It's the f1.9 aperture. This lens is basically a tiny black hole. Well, I mean, not really. It's an f1.9 lens, but because the medium format image is so much larger than the frame of 35mm, that equates to about a f1.2 lens in 35mm land. So pretty wide. You're gonna get some nice smooth bokeh with this lens. And that's the magic of this lens. Like the 0.95 Leica or the f1.0 Leica or any of the fast Voigtlander lenses, that's the appeal of this lens. For folks who like to really blow out the background and to have a really fast lens, that's the appeal of this lens. And the bokeh is fantastic. That's not to say that things are perfect. We're gonna play a litll bit of devil's advocate here. There are certain situations where the bokeh can get a little bit nervous, so you do have to be careful. Things can be jittery. I mentioned this earlier, but the 80mm focal length used natively in 645 is roughly equivalent to a 50mm lens in 35mm land. So it's basically the spork of focal length. So you can use it for portraits, landscapes. It's a standard lens. You can use it for a lot of different things. You never know when you're gonna find yourself in a KFC bowl situation. You gotta be prepared. As with any other fast aperture lens though, the question always is, how does the lens perform wide open? Oftentimes, manufacturers put out a lens touting a really fast aperture, really wide aperture, and the lens just completely falls apart and the image quality is terrible wide open. I'm happy to report that that is just not the case on this lens. I've taken a bunch of images at f1.9 and the quality is just superb. So rest assured, you're gonna be able to get good sharp images even wide open, and that's awesome. I mean, here's a shot of what you can expect wide open. Just as sharp as a velociraptor's big toe. Also, being a standard lens, the lens doesn't distort much at all. No funky mirror, maze, funhouse stuff here, just good normal images. Straight lines will stay straight. I've used this lens primarily on my Mamiya M645, and honestly, it's a dream. The lens offers a really unique look with very high image quality. People all the time talk about the medium format look, so to speak. From my understanding, the medium format look is a shallow depth of field and nice crispy sharpness in the foreground, and this lens offers that in spades. Using this lens natively on the Mamiya body is the way to go, but there is actually another way, and the keen observer will notice that I actually have an adapter on the lens. I have a Nikon F-mount adapter that's on the back of the lens. And I've been shooting with my Nikon D600. You know, shout out to Nikon. Primarily a Sony shooter in digital, but I have a Nikon still. You can actually adapt this excellent piece of glass to work with modern digital cameras. I will say without modern focus peaking on the Nikon D600, nailing focus is incredibly hard because there's no magnifier. But when I'm able to hit focus, this lens does a really nice job. Even using modern digital sensors, this lens is still able to resolve tons and tons of detail. I also know that something that's very popular to do with this lens is adapt it to the Fuji GFX system. I know for the longest time there weren't that many lenses out for it, and most of the ones that were available, well, honestly, they're still really expensive. So adapting this lens to the Fuji GFX system a lot of times is a really attractive option for folks as well. A couple of other negative things, not really negative things, it's nothing too bad, but this lens is quite expensive. I told you that I paid about $400 for it, and this is an old lens, and it's kind of a novelty, right? Most of the folks who are getting into old camera systems aren't super interested in paying a lot for the lenses. It's also really hard to justify it as well when you can get that other 80mm, the 80mm 2.8 for less than $100. So this one's 4 times more money. But I would argue that it is a much more unique lens and you will be much more satisfied with your images from that. So where does that leave us on this lens? Well, if you're buying this lens to use natively on medium format, this lens is easy to recommend. It's one of the greatest medium format lenses that I'm happy to recommend this lens to you to use on your Mamiya 645. Also, if you're adapting this lens to use on modern medium format camera systems like the Fuji GFX or the Hasselblad X1D, this is also another scenario where I would recommend this lens. The native lenses for those systems are incredibly expensive, and this gives you a lens that's going to give you all the coverage you need to cover that medium format image sensor, so you're not getting tons of bokeh or only getting a crop of the image. This lens has all the coverage you need. This lens represents a great option there as well. The one situation where I wouldn't recommend this lens though is adapting it to a modern 35mm digital camera. If you're grabbing this lens to use on 35mm cameras, most likely there is a 50mm 1.8 lens or an 85mm 1.8 lens already available for less money. So I would recommend you just pick that up. It's probably going to perform better on your camera anyway and offer autofocus and give you pretty similar results. And the 1.9 aperture is honestly not that remarkable on 35mm. So there are better options to be had. So that's where I'm at on this bad boy. Check out this other video where I talk about some of my favorite affordable options for medium format film. But thank you guys for watching.